New York City, 1964. A man named Gene Roberts sat in the inner circle of Malcolm X's security detail. He attended meetings. He traveled with Malcolm. He stood close enough to hear private conversations. He knew Malcolm's schedule, his contacts, his fears, his evolving political philosophy. He was trusted. He was loyal. He was also a New York Police Department undercover officer, feeding intelligence to the FBI, documenting everything he witnessed, building a file that grew thicker with every week he spent inside the organization Malcolm had built. Gene Roberts was, by any definition, a spy, and for years, he believed he was doing his job well. Until the afternoon Malcolm X looked directly at him across a crowded room, held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and said 2 words that Roberts would spend the next 30 years trying to understand. "I see you." Not a greeting, not a pleasantry. A statement of fact delivered with the calm of a man who has known something for a long time and decided the moment had arrived to say it out loud. Roberts kept his face neutral, said nothing, looked away, but inside, something collapsed. Because if Malcolm knew, if he had always known, then everything Roberts thought he understood about surveillance, about intelligence work, about the power dynamic between the watcher and the watched, was wrong. 30 years later, testifying in a New York courtroom in 1995, Gene Roberts said something that made the room go quiet. Malcolm X was watching us, not the other way around. He knew I was there. He knew what I was. And he used that knowledge in ways I didn't understand until decades later. This is the story of the man who watched Malcolm X, and what Malcolm X saw when he looked back. Gene Roberts joined the New York Police Department in the late 1950s, one of a small cohort of black officers recruited specifically for undercover work in black political organizations at a time when the FBI's COINTELPRO program was expanding its reach with increasing aggression and decreasing oversight. The program, formerly the counterintelligence program, had been running since 1956. Its stated purpose was to protect national security by surveilling and disrupting domestic political organizations deemed subversive. In practice, COINTELPRO was a systematic campaign against the Black Freedom Movement, using infiltration, disinformation, manufactured conflicts, and psychological warfare to neutralize leaders and organizations the government feared not because they were violent, but because they were effective. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had identified black political leadership as one of the primary domestic threats to what Hoover called the established order. Malcolm X was at the top of that list. Hoover had been tracking Malcolm since 1953. But tracking wasn't the same as understanding, and understanding required people inside. The logic of using black officers for this work was cynically straightforward. White FBI agents couldn't infiltrate organizations whose membership was exclusively black without immediately triggering suspicion. They needed people who could blend in, build genuine relationships, earn real trust over time, and maintain those relationships for years without revealing themselves. The work required a particular psychological profile, someone capable of sustained performance of identity, someone who could hold 2 versions of themselves simultaneously, the version the community saw and trusted, and the version that filed reports and attended debriefings. Someone who could be genuinely present in a room while being fundamentally absent from it. Roberts fit the profile. He was trained. He was placed. And by 1964, he was exactly where his handlers wanted him, close to Malcolm, trusted, invisible as an informant. He thought. Malcolm X had been thinking about surveillance since before Gene Roberts was born. He had studied the history of the FBI's infiltration of Marcus Garvey's organization in the 1920s, an infiltration so thorough it contributed directly to Garvey's deportation. He had watched the Nation of Islam's internal security apparatus function during his 12 years as Elijah Muhammad's most prominent spokesman. He knew that any organization challenging American power would be infiltrated. He knew the infiltration would use people who looked like the community being surveilled. He knew the infiltrators would be talented, committed to their cover, difficult to identify through normal means. Malcolm didn't need to catch Roberts with a recording device or a secret document. He identified him through a different kind of intelligence, behavioral. Roberts was too careful. His caution was a shade more precise than genuine loyalty required. His questions were slightly too useful to the people who would want to know what Malcolm was thinking. The quality of his attention was subtly different from that of a man committed to a cause versus a man documenting it. Malcolm had spent years reading rooms, reading faces, reading the hidden architecture of loyalty and betrayal. Roberts was hiding in that architecture, and Malcolm found him. The moment in 1964 when Malcolm said, "I see you," was not an accusation. It was not a confrontation. It was not designed to expose Roberts or force a crisis. It was a message, a carefully chosen, precisely delivered communication that said, "I know what you are. I have known for some time. I am choosing to tell you that I know. And I am not removing you, which means I have reasons for keeping you here that you don't yet understand." Roberts didn't understand what happened in the days immediately following that moment. He filed his reports. He continued his work. He waited for some consequence that never came. Malcolm didn't expose him to the OAU, didn't have him removed from the security detail, didn't change his behavior in ways that would suggest he was being careful around Roberts. He simply continued to let Roberts be present. And that decision, which Roberts spent decades trying to analyze, revealed something profound about Malcolm's strategic thinking. Malcolm X wasn't just a speaker. He wasn't just an organizer. He was a sophisticated practitioner of counterintelligence who understood that knowing about surveillance was more valuable than eliminating it. By keeping Roberts close after identifying him, Malcolm gained several things simultaneously. First, he had a channel through which he could control what the FBI and NYPD believed they knew about his activities. If Malcolm wanted certain information to reach the surveillance apparatus, information designed to mislead, to protect real plans, to send investigators toward decoys, he could communicate it through Roberts' natural observation without Roberts understanding he was being used as a conduit. Second, Roberts' continued presence gave Malcolm a real-time intelligence map, the focus of Roberts' attention, the questions he asked in meetings, the moments where his listening seemed to sharpen. All of this told Malcolm what the surveillance apparatus was most concerned about. What scared the FBI was legible in what their informant paid closest attention to. Third, and perhaps most importantly, keeping Roberts close while knowing his true identity meant Malcolm was never fully blindsided by the surveillance surrounding him. He knew it existed. He could account for it. He could calibrate his public statements, his organizational decisions, and his private communications accordingly, creating layers of meaning that Roberts could observe the surface of without ever fully grasping the depth below. The informant didn't have power over Malcolm because Malcolm had power over the informant's ignorance. The surveillance apparatus thought it was reading Malcolm X. Malcolm X was reading the surveillance apparatus back, and doing it better. The government had one trained undercover officer inside the OAU. Malcolm X had a window into the entire structure of federal attention to his work. The asymmetry of intelligence, when examined from this angle, was not in the FBI's favor. It never was. They just didn't know that until Roberts told them 30 years after it was over. Gene Roberts was present at the Audubon Ballroom on February 21st, 1965. He was part of the security detail that day. The security detail that Malcolm had controversially ordered to come unarmed, a decision that Roberts had been unable to change any more than the other bodyguards could. Roberts stood near the back of the room, positioned as trained, watching the crowd, tracking movement, cataloging faces. He recognized Talmadge Hayer in the audience. He had seen him before. Whether he recognized him as a threat in those moments before the shooting, whether he could have acted on that recognition, even if unarmed, was a question Roberts never answered directly in any public forum. What he did say was that when the shooting started, the first shotgun blast that hit Malcolm in the chest at close range, followed immediately by pistol fire from at least two other positions. Roberts moved toward the stage, not away from it. The crowd was surging in the opposite direction. 400 people trying to reach the same exit simultaneously. Screaming. A smoke bomb. Children crying. Betty Shabazz shielding her daughters with her body. And Roberts pushing against the tide, toward the stage, toward the man lying on the floor with 16 bullets in his body. He reached Malcolm within seconds of the shooting stopping. He knelt on the floor. Betty was there, cradling Malcolm's head, saying his name, her voice not screaming anymore, but speaking with particular urgency of someone who refuses to accept what they're seeing. Roberts looked at Malcolm's face. Then he did something the surveillance file he'd been building for years could never have predicted. He bent down and began performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, pressing his hands to Malcolm's chest, breathing into the mouth of the man he had been reporting on to the FBI and NYPD for months. The man who had looked at him in 1964 and said, "I see you." Roberts worked until the ambulance arrived. Malcolm was already gone before he got there. Roberts stood up, filed his report that night, and carried what had happened in that room for 30 years before he spoke about it publicly. Malcolm died before the ambulance arrived. Roberts stood up. The room was chaos. He filed his report that night. His handlers received it. The surveillance file that had been growing for years now had a final entry, and Gene Roberts continued his undercover career, working other assignments, other infiltrations, other communities the government had decided needed to be watched. He didn't speak publicly about his time with Malcolm for years. The details of his infiltration were classified. The extent of his role was not publicly known. He moved through the years after 1965, carrying what he knew in silence. The silence of a man who had been in a position to observe something extraordinary and couldn't talk about it without revealing things he wasn't supposed to reveal. Or perhaps the silence of a man who wasn't entirely sure, when he looked back, which side of the moral ledger his work belonged on. In 1995, 30 years after Malcolm's assassination, Gene Roberts testified in a New York courtroom. The case involved a 1971 police action known as the Panther 21 trial, in which Roberts had been an undercover operative inside the Black Panther Party. The testimony required Roberts to account for his history as an undercover agent, which meant accounting for his time inside Malcolm X's organization. For the first time in 3 decades, Roberts spoke in a public forum about what he had witnessed. He described his infiltration of the OAU. He described his role in the security detail. He described being present at the Audubon Ballroom. And then he said something that made the courtroom go quiet and the court stenographer look up from her machine. Malcolm X was aware of my role. He was monitoring me as much as I was monitoring him. He knew I was there. He chose to keep me there. I believe he was using our presence to manage what information reached the FBI and NYPD. He was the most sophisticated individual I encountered in 30 years of undercover work. We thought we were watching him. He was watching us. We thought we had intelligence on him. He had intelligence on us. The courtroom absorbed this. A former government undercover agent, testifying under oath, saying that the man he'd been assigned to surveil had outmaneuvered the entire surveillance apparatus that had followed him for years. The implications of Roberts' testimony extended far beyond his personal account. If Malcolm X had identified his primary FBI informant and chosen to keep him in place as part of a deliberate counterintelligence strategy, then the picture of Malcolm as an unaware target of state surveillance was wrong. Malcolm was not a man being watched by forces he didn't understand. He was a man engaging actively and strategically with those forces, using their own tools against them. This reframing changes how we understand Malcolm's final year. The decisions that seemed like mistakes, the controversial speech about Kennedy's assassination, the public break with the nation, the increasingly international focus of his work, the very public nature of his movements in the final weeks, begin to look different if you understand them as coming from a man who knew he was being watched and was choosing carefully what the watcher saw. The mistakes might have been deliberate. The apparent vulnerabilities might have been strategic, or they might have been genuine miscalculations by a man who was exhausted, hunted, and human. Roberts' testimony doesn't resolve this. It deepens it. What Roberts' account does establish beyond dispute is that Malcolm X was not naive about the surveillance environment he operated in. He was sophisticated about it. He had developed, through years of experience in organizations that the government consistently infiltrated, a capacity for reading people and situations that went beyond ordinary social intelligence. He knew what betrayal looked like from the inside. He knew what loyalty performed for strategic reasons felt like in a room. And he knew that the response to surveillance wasn't necessarily exposure or confrontation. Sometimes it was knowing, just knowing, holding the knowledge carefully and using it not as a weapon, but as a key. A way of understanding the geometry of the room you were in, who was watching which exits, who was reporting to whom, and how that knowledge could be leveraged into something that looked like ordinary behavior, but was actually a kind of strategic theater. Malcolm X ran that theater for years. Gene Roberts was one of his unwitting actors, and the performance only became visible decades later in a New York courtroom, when an aging undercover agent tried to explain what it had been like to be watched by the man he was watching. Gene Roberts died in 2019. He had lived long enough to see his testimony discussed in books about Malcolm X, in documentaries, in academic papers on the history of FBI surveillance of black political movements. He had lived long enough to watch the 2021 exoneration of two men wrongly convicted of Malcolm's murder, an exoneration that came with the admission that the FBI and NYPD had withheld evidence and interfered with the investigation. He had lived long enough to understand that the surveillance apparatus he'd served had not just watched Malcolm X. It had helped create the conditions for his death. Whether Roberts made peace with his role in that apparatus, whether he found a way to account for the CPR on the Audubon floor alongside the reports filed to his handlers, whether the 3 seconds of eye contact in 1964, "I see you," stayed with him the way it had shaped everything that followed, he didn't say publicly. What he left behind was the testimony. 30 years after Malcolm's death, a government agent, under oath, admitting that the man he was sent to watch had been watching him back, that the power of surveillance had been, in some fundamental way, reversed, and that the most sophisticated mind in the room had not been in the surveillance apparatus. It had been at the dispatch box of the Oxford Union, at the podium of the Audubon Ballroom, and in a crowded room in 1964, looking at Gene Roberts with perfect clarity and saying two words that contained everything: "I see you."